Hi everyone, back again, and we are almost finished with our story, The Chocolate Touch. Today we're going to read chapters 10 and 11, and there's only 12 chapters in the book, so we're getting there. And we're going to get started right away on chapter 10. So, dragging along and thinking of all the dreadful things that had happened, John had walked about halfway home when he heard the cheery voice of his father. "Hello, hello," called Mr. Midas, crossing over from the other side of the street. He was on his way home from the station. "You left the party rather early, didn't you?" "What?" Mr. Midas had just seen the patches and streaks of chocolate that were drying on John's face and on his clothes. "Good gracious," he said. "No wonder you left the party early. How did that happen?" John burst into tears. It had all been so awful, but now he could tell his father about his terrible day. He stopped crying and only sniffled a little now, and then as he told the whole story about taking the coin to the candy store, about buying the box that had turned out to have only one chocolate in it, about the toothpaste, about breakfast, the gloves, the silver dollar, the pencil, the lunch, the trumpet, and finally, the apple ducking water. "You mean to tell me they really all turned to chocolate?" Mr. Midas asked. "You're sure you didn't just imagine some of this?" "Oh, no," John assured him. "Well," Mr. Midas said, still looking doubtful, "we're only a couple of blocks from that candy store of yours. Not that I've ever noticed one there. Suppose we stroll over and ask the man whether his chocolates always do strange things to people." "It's on the next corner," John said, recognizing some of the houses on the side street. "Not the next house, not the next house, not the next," he said, "but—" John's voice faded into silence. The corner where he had found the candy store was nothing now but an empty lot. Flat, open ground littered with a pile of rusty tin cans and broken bottles around a splintery old sign saying, "For sale." Said Mr. Midas, frowning anxiously at John. "I think we'd better pay a visit to Dr. Cranium before we go home." "That's where the store was, though," John protested, beginning to cry again. He had shed more tears in that one day, it seemed, and certainly eaten more chocolate than in all the other days of his life put together. "I know it was." Dr. Cranium was a busy man. As luck would have it, however, he was able to see Mr. Midas and John almost at once. "Well, well, 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 well," said Dr. Cranium. "And how are we getting along now, John? Have we cut down on our candy, eh?" "How do you do?" John responded dully. "Apparently he's had a bad day, Dr. Cranium," Mr. Midas said. "Trouble at school, you know, and a little accident at a birthday party. What I'm worried about is that he keeps saying that everything he puts into his mouth turns to chocolate." "No more than a nursery fantasy, I'm sure," Dr. Cranium said to Mr. Midas. "Well, John," he went on, looking down with a smile, "suppose you tell me in your own words what the matter seems to be." "Everything I put into my mouth turns to chocolate," John explained. "Everything I eat and everything I drink changes into chocolate. I'm thirsty, and I'm getting a pain. A bad one, I think." Dr. Cranium sighed patiently and invited John to open his mouth and say "ah." "Ah," John said. Dr. Cranium peered into John's mouth briefly and gave a low whistle of surprise. "This chocolate eating simply must stop." He went to a supply cabinet. "I don't think there's any time to be lost," he told Mr. Midas. "I'm going to give the boy some of my own special compound. Dr. Cranium's elixir, I call it. Never fails." Dr. Cranium selected a large bottle from one of the cabinet's crowded shelves. He removed the top from the bottle. He got a spoon from another shelf. He filled the spoon with an oily greenish yellow medicine that had yellowish reddish lights glinting in it. It doesn't taste very pleasant, Dr. Cranium warned John in a pleasant tone of voice, but I'm sure it'll do the trick. Clear the stomach and clear the mind. That's what I always say. Dr. Cranium offered John the brimful spoon. Must I? John asked his father. I know it'll turn into chocolate. Go on, Mr. Midas nodded encouragingly. Drink it down. John took the spoon between his lips. The medicine turned to chocolate. The spoon turned to chocolate. John choked and spluttered the chocolate syrup, and it spurted from his mouth. Dr. Cranium dropped the spoon in alarm. When it struck the white-tiled floor, the chocolate handle snapped into several pieces. Mercy! Dr. Cranium said. I've never seen anything like it. The boy's whole system seems to be chocolatified. That it chocolatifies everything it touches. After he had recovered somewhat, the doctor went on. I believe that this must be an unprecedented case of, chocolatitis. I shall call it Cranium's disease. I shall want to make an exhaustive study of the child. I think John has had enough excitement for one day, Mr. Midas said. Okay, that's the end of chapter 10, and now we're going to read chapter 11. Mrs. Midas was much upset when Mr. Midas told her that John had Dr. Cranium's disease. He said it was chocolatitis, Mr. Midas explained, a worried frown on his face. But he's calling it Cranium's disease because it was his discovery. Dr. Cranium didn't do it, John said. It's magic. It all started after I ate that chocolate. I'm scared, he added. Mrs. Midas sat down and dabbed her eyes with a lace handkerchief. She was crying. Mr. Midas blew his nose, said he had to attend to something, and abruptly left the room. John had been so busy feeling sorry for himself that he had not realized how his mother and father would feel about his chocolate disease. Never mind, Mother, he said, putting his arm around her shoulders. It's all right, really. Nothing was all right, but he couldn't bear to see his mother's tears. He kissed her wet cheek. His eyes were shut as his lips softly touched her, so he didn't see the change right away. Then his lips began to feel sticky. He opened his eyes. His mother had turned into a lifeless statue of chocolate. John ran wildly out of the house without thinking where he was going or what he was going to do. All he knew was that somehow he must get help. For the first time in a long while, he forgot about himself altogether. Now he didn't care about anything but bringing his mother back to life. Without quite knowing how he got there, John found himself at the corner where he had bought the chocolate box. The lot was no longer an untidy rubbish dump. The neat red brick building with 2 show windows was exactly where it had been in the first place. But the display of candy he had previously seen in the windows was no longer there. In one window, John saw a chocolate trumpet, a chocolate pencil, and a silver dollar with a piece bitten out of it. In the other window, he saw a cafeteria tray littered with chocolate utensils and the remains of a chocolate lunch. Clearly this place was the right one. Clearly the proprietor must know a lot about John's hateful chocolate touch. John rushed into the store. The proprietor was standing behind the counter, carefully polishing something small and round and flat and silver. I was just thinking of you, he said. Okay, so the author uses the word proprietor 2 times, and I'm not really sure what that means, but based on the words around it and what I'm reading about, I can probably infer that it must mean owner, because it's talking about the proprietor and how he's standing behind the counter. And it's the same guy that he met the other day. And so I can infer that proprietor most likely means the owner of the store. John had no time to waste on pleasantries. "Remember the old coin I found and gave you, and you gave me a magic chocolate?" he demanded. Without waiting for a reply, he babbled on. "Well, I ate it, and it made everything that touches my mouth turn to chocolate, and I kissed my mother, and now she's chocolate, and I've got to change her back." "Easy now," murmured the storekeeper. "Calm yourself." There was an expression of satisfaction in the old man's eyes. "It's all your fault," John declared. "If my mother isn't made better again, I'll fight you till you're dead." "My goodness," the storekeeper exclaimed. "Whose fault, did you say?" "Yours," John said. "If you hadn't taken that money, I wouldn't have—" "Now, John," the storekeeper interrupted, "I must insist on honesty. I'm glad to hear that you're thinking about your mother for a change. Unselfishness is important, but honesty is also important. If you'll be truthful, perhaps I can help you." John's ears reddened. It was becoming unmistakably evident to him that he only had himself to blame for all this unhappiness. He looked straight into the storekeeper's eyes. "I'll do anything. I'll work for you all my life for nothing if you'll turn my mother back. You can turn me to chocolate instead if you want. The storekeeper apparently ignored John's offers. "You were right, John," he said, "when you guessed that I had something to do with your acquiring the chocolate touch. But you yourself earned the coin that bought the chocolate touch. Only greedy people can even see that kind of money. Dr. Cranium was right up to a point. I suppose that one could say that you had chocolatitis, but it was just an outward sign of selfishness." "My mother," John reminded the storekeeper frantically. "My mother's turned to chocolate. Do something about it. Oh, please, do something about it." "I'm glad that you are concerned," the storekeeper commented unhurriedly. "Part of your cure is to be concerned about other people. You have been so greedy that you didn't care what happened to other people." "Oh, I know," John admitted woefully. "But please decide about me later. And please make my mother better now." "Well, John," the storekeeper said, "if you had to choose between getting rid of your chocolate touch and restoring your mother to life, which would it be?" For one moment, John couldn't help imagining a future of all chocolate meals. The thought was terrible. But then he thought of his mother as she had been when he had left her, a motionless chocolate statue, unable to speak, her chocolate hand still holding her lace handkerchief. Without further hesitation, John said, "Help my mother." "Well, John," the storekeeper said, "I am going to give you another chance. When next you go to school, your chocolate pencil will be a real wooden pencil with lead in it." "But," John began to protest, "what did the pencil matter? The chocolate knife and fork and spoon you left on your tray in the cafeteria will have turned back to metal. Your chocolate trumpet will be a shiny golden one again." "But," John said, "don't worry about Dr. Cranium's spoon. He will find a whole silver one on the floor where the broken chocolate one lay." "But how about," John said, "Susan Buttercup will discover that the chocolate stains on her party dress and her party shoes were nothing but water after all. Her silver dollar will be all right." John could stand the suspense no longer. "My mother!" he shouted. "What about my mother? Will she be all right?" The storekeeper smiled. "Why don't you run along home and find out?" he suggested. John turned without even saying goodbye and ran out of the store. The storekeeper went back to the disc that he had been polishing, a disc the size of a quarter. It had to be polished smoothly, ready for a new set of initials in case the need for them should arise. Okay, so that is the end of chapter 11. We have one more chapter to go, and then the story will be done. So before we go today, I wanted to have a little discussion with you about the word theme. Okay, does anybody know what theme is? Okay, so theme is the message or the lesson that the author is trying to get across to us. It's like a lesson that the author wants us to learn. And in a lot of books, the author has a theme, and most of the time, he or she doesn't really come right out and tell us what that theme is. They don't say, oh, and the theme of this story is, they don't usually do that, okay? Unless it's a fable where the author will tell us the moral of the story in the end. So how do we figure out what the theme is then? Well, what we have to do is we have to infer it based on the entire story and what the author tells us throughout the story. We should hopefully be able to figure out what the author's message is. I like to think of it as, what is my takeaway? Okay, when I read a story, what do I get out of it? What can I take away from the story that I can apply to my own life? That's what the theme is. Okay, so we've just read almost this entire story. This last chapter, I think, had a really big part in giving us a lot of information about what the theme of the story is and what the author wants us to take away from this story and be able to apply to our own lives. So here's what I'd like you to do for the next time. I'd like you to try and think about, what is the theme of this story? What is your takeaway? What do you get out of this story that you can apply to your own life? What is important in the author's eyes? What does he want us to know and take with us into the future? Okay, so what I'd like you to do is I would like you to try to write an explanatory essay where your first sentence tells me what your theme is that you reached from this story, okay? And then I would like you to support that theme with at least 3 pieces of evidence from the story. Now, I know you don't have the story in front of you, but I want you to try to remember back, and you can look at previous videos if you'd like. This chapter that I just read has a lot of really good information about what the theme of the story actually is. So I want you to think about that. Think about what the storekeeper or the proprietor of the store was trying to really teach John about, what had happened throughout the story. Okay, and I want you to apply that in an essay. So again, what I'd like you to do is I'd like you to write an explanatory essay where you explain what the theme is, and then you support it with at least 3 pieces of evidence from the text. Okay, and when we come back the next time, we will finish the story and see what happens at the end. And I will give you a few other activities that you can work on after that. Okay, so I enjoyed working with you again today as usual, and I look forward to meeting with you one more time so that we can finish the story and find out what happens to John. Okay, bye, and I will see you next time.